The holographic display flickered to life in the center of the vast lecture hall, casting blue light across hundreds of alien faces. Professor Kiv adjusted the crystalline formations along their arm, a gesture that among the Therian species indicated deep academic focus. The specimen rotating slowly in the light looked utterly unremarkable, a small oval grain with a tough brown shell. "Class, observe this pathetic example of evolutionary failure," Kiv announced, their voice carrying easily through the amphitheater's acoustics. "Discovered on the third planet of the Sol system, this seed represents what happens when natural selection goes terribly wrong." The students leaned forward with various appendages, eyes, and sensory organs. Some took notes by secreting different colored inks onto biopaper. Others recorded everything through direct neural interfaces. A few species simply absorbed the information through specialized skin patches that could store data for later review. Kiv manipulated the hologram, showing cross-sections of the grain. "Notice the incredibly thick hull. This protective coating is so dense that most digestive systems cannot break it down. The energy required to process this matter exceeds any possible nutritional return by a factor of 3 to 1. In the back corner of the lecture hall, Ben shifted uncomfortably in his specially designed chair. Human furniture requirements had posed quite a challenge for the Galactic Agricultural Institute. Most species either floated, crystallized themselves into stable forms, or required environmental suits filled with their native atmosphere. Ben just needed somewhere to sit, which somehow made him the odd one out. The professor continued their lecture with growing enthusiasm. "This specimen perfectly illustrates the concept of evolutionary dead ends. The parent plant expends enormous energy creating these seeds, yet they provide no benefit to any known species. They cannot be digested by standard biological processes. They resist decomposition for years, clogging soil and preventing more useful plants from taking root." A student near the front, resembling a large purple starfish, released a cloud of orange spores, the Calarian equivalent of raising a hand. "Professor Kiv, why would any planet waste resources producing such useless matter?" "Excellent question, Reef," Kiv replied. The professor's crystalline form brightened, indicating pleasure at the intellectual engagement. "This is precisely why we study failed evolutionary branches. By understanding what does not work, we better appreciate successful adaptations." Ben watched as more examples appeared in the hologram. He recognized rice, corn, barley, and oats, each one dismissed as biological waste. His stomach rumbled quietly, reminding him that breakfast had consisted of toast made from the very evolutionary failure currently being mocked by one of the galaxy's leading experts. "These Terra specimens represent nature at its most cruel," Kiv continued. "Imagine a starving creature encountering these seeds, the promise of nutrition, yet the reality of indigestion and wasted energy. Some preliminary studies suggest that consuming these items might actually harm most species' digestive systems." Several students emitted stress pheromones at the thought. The Vorthak delegate, breathing methane through a specialized mask, made a sound that translated roughly to horrifying. A group of insectoid students clicked their mandibles in what Ben had learned was sympathy for hypothetical suffering organisms. Ben looked around the lecture hall, taking in the incredible diversity of galactic life. There were species made of living crystal, others that looked like walking trees, some that seemed to be held together by pure energy fields. Each had evolved on worlds perfectly suited to their biology. Each had found their place in environments that provided exactly what they needed to survive. Earth had been different. Earth had been hostile. The professor was now showing soil samples from various worlds. Compare these nutrient-rich substrates from successful agricultural planets to this. The hologram displayed a handful of what Ben recognized as simple dirt. Terra's soil requires extensive processing to support even basic plant life. Most of the planet's surface appears to be actively hostile to vegetation. This was true enough. Ben remembered his grandfather's stories about turning rocky fields into farmland, about fighting weeds and weather and insects for every harvest. Other species had found paradise worlds where fruit literally fell from trees into their mouths. Humans had found a planet that seemed determined to kill everything growing on it. Yet somehow, Kiv said, manipulating the display to show Earth's continents, Life on this world persisted in creating these useless seeds by the billions. Entire landscapes covered in plants devoted to producing indigestible waste. It is, perhaps, the most inefficient biological system we have yet encountered. Ben felt a familiar stirring of what his grandmother had called Earth pride. She had been the first human to leave the solar system, part of the early diplomatic missions that established humanity's place in galactic society. She had always told him that humans had something special, something that other species hadn't quite figured out yet. Are there any questions about this fascinating example of evolutionary failure? Professor Kiv asked. Beginning to dim the holographic display, Ben raised his hand. The gesture caused a small sensation. Most species communicated through bioluminescent displays, chemical releases, or telepathic connections. The simple act of lifting an appendage to gain attention was considered quaint at best, primitive at worst. Several students turned to stare at him with whatever sensory organs they possessed. Professor Kiv's crystalline structure flickered, the Therian equivalent of a surprised blink. Yes, human Ben? Ben stood up slowly, aware that his movement was causing nervous energy to ripple through the lecture hall. Humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy. They came from a death world. They were unpredictable. They had strange ideas about things like personal space and individual rights that made other species uncomfortable. But they were also known for surviving in places where other species died. Professor Kiv, Ben said politely, we call that food. The lecture hall fell completely silent. Even the environmental system seemed to pause. The Vorthax stopped breathing methane. The crystalline students ceased their harmonic vibrations. The energy-based life forms dimmed to almost nothing. That's wheat, Ben continued, pointing at the hologram. My species has been eating it for about 10,000 years. We grow it on purpose. It's the foundation of human agriculture. Professor Kiv's entire body went through a rapid series of color changes that Ben's translation software couldn't quite parse. Finally, the professor managed to speak. That is impossible. Professor Kiv's crystalline form continued shifting through colors that Ben's translator couldn't identify, finally settling on a deep purple that seemed to pulse with academic curiosity, mixed with professional embarrassment. The silence in the lecture hall stretched on as hundreds of alien minds tried to process what they had just heard. Human Ben, the professor said carefully, each word measured like a precise scientific instrument. You are claiming that your species intentionally consumes biological matter that our comprehensive analysis has proven to be nutritionally worthless and potentially harmful. Ben nodded simply. Yes, sir. We also eat rice, corn, oats, and barley. You showed all of them in your presentation. A ripple of movement went through the student body. The Calarian student named Reef released a spray of yellow spores that Ben's translator interpreted as confusion bordering on panic. The insectoid students began clicking their mandibles rapidly, creating a sound like rattling coins. Even the energy-based life forms started flickering in patterns that suggested agitation. This is scientifically impossible, Kiv stated, manipulating the holographic controls to bring up detailed nutritional analyses. Our studies clearly show that these seeds contain complex starches that cannot be broken down by standard digestive enzymes. The energy expenditure required to process them exceeds their caloric content by a significant margin. Ben watched as charts and graphs filled the space around the floating grain samples. Every measurement, every analysis, every scientific projection supported Professor Kiv's conclusion. The wheat was, according to galactic science, utterly worthless as food. Perhaps, suggested a student that looked like a walking tree with silver bark, the human is mistaken about his species' dietary habits. Ben almost smiled at that. No, sir. Wheat is so important to humans that we've built entire civilizations around it. We've fought wars over farmland. We measure wealth partly by how much grain a person can store. It's probably the most important plant in human history. The tree student's leaves rustled, and what Ben had learned was the equivalent of shocked disbelief. You fought wars over inedible seeds? We fought wars because they're very edible, Ben corrected. At least they are if you know how to prepare them. Professor Kiv had been running additional scans while Ben spoke. The results only seemed to deepen their confusion. Human Ben, I'm detecting no obvious physiological adaptations that would allow your species to process these materials. Your digestive system appears remarkably similar to other omnivorous species we have studied. Could I ask you something, Professor? Ben said, still standing in the back of the hall. Have your studies included any actual feeding trials? The question caused another stir among the students. Ben realized he had inadvertently challenged the professor's methodology, which in academic circles was roughly equivalent to questioning someone's honor. Professor Kiv's crystal structure brightened to nearly white, which Ben hoped was indignation rather than rage. Our analytical methods are the most sophisticated in the galaxy, human. We do not need to resort to crude trial and error experimentation when we have molecular-level scanning capabilities. Ben tried to find a diplomatic way to phrase his next thought. With respect, Professor, maybe the scanning is missing something important. Such as? Ben looked around the lecture hall, taking in hundreds of alien faces watching him with fascination, confusion, and in some cases what appeared to be concern for his mental stability. He realized that what he was about to suggest would sound completely insane to species that had evolved on worlds where food was abundant and easily digestible. Maybe you need to see a human actually eat it. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The Vorthak student made a sound that the translator rendered as absolutely horrified shrieking. Several of the insectoid students began secreting stress, chemicals that made the air shimmer. The energy-based life forms flickered so rapidly they looked like short-circuiting lights. Professor Kiv's color had shifted to something Ben's translator labeled as deeply concerned curiosity. After a long moment, the professor spoke. You are suggesting a live demonstration. If you want, Ben said. I mean, if you have access to a food preparation area, I could show you how humans process wheat. It's not complicated. This was clearly not how academic presentations were supposed to go. Ben could see Dr. Yen, the human liaison, making her way down the amphitheater steps with an expression of mixed pride and panic. She had warned Ben that humans had a reputation for being unpredictable and that he should try to avoid proving that reputation correct. Too late now. Professor Kiv, Dr. Yen called out as she reached the bottom of the lecture hall. If I may suggest, the agricultural laboratory has full food preparation facilities. We could conduct a controlled demonstration, if you're interested in pursuing this academically. The professor's crystalline structure went through another series of rapid color changes. Ben was beginning to recognize this as the Therian equivalent of thinking very hard. Finally, Kiv settled on a steady blue glow. This is highly irregular, the professor announced to the class. However, the scientific method demands that we investigate unexpected claims, regardless of how unlikely they may seem. The blue glow intensified. Class dismissed. Any students interested in observing this demonstration may proceed to Agricultural Laboratory 7. The movement that followed was unlike anything Ben had seen in his months at the Institute. Species that normally moved with careful dignity suddenly seemed energized by curiosity. Students who usually avoided each other due to biological incompatibilities found themselves clustered together, all heading toward the same destination. As Ben followed the crowd toward the laboratory, he heard Dr. Yen's voice beside him. Do you have any idea what you've just started? Ben thought about his grandmother's stories, about the first humans to leave Earth and the shock they had caused when other species realized where they came from. I think I'm about to show them something they've never seen before. That's what I'm afraid of, Dr. Yen muttered. But she was smiling as she said it. Behind them, Professor Kiv was already sending messages to colleagues throughout the institute. Word was spreading rapidly through the academic community. A human was about to attempt to consume what galactic science had classified as inedible waste. By the time they reached the laboratory, the observation deck was filling with faculty members and graduate students from a dozen different species. Ben realized he was about to have a much larger audience than he had expected. The demonstration was about to begin. Agricultural Laboratory 7 had never hosted an audience quite like this one. The observation deck, designed to accommodate maybe 30 researchers, now held nearly 100 beings from across the galaxy. Professor Kiv had managed to secure a small sample of wheat from the Institute's specimen collection, though they clearly expected nothing to come of it. Ben stood at the central workstation, acutely aware that every sensor, scanner, and recording device in the facility was focused on him. Dr. Yen had positioned herself near the emergency controls, just in case the human actually managed to poison himself in front of the galaxy's leading agricultural experts. "Before I begin," Ben said, his voice carried throughout the lab by the translation system, "I should explain that this isn't just about eating wheat. This is about the relationship between humans and plants." He held up the small handful of grain that Professor Kiv had provided. Under the laboratory's bright lights, the wheat looked even more unpromising than it had in the hologram. The kernels were hard, dry, and utterly unappetizing by any reasonable standard. "Most species find food that's already prepared by nature," Ben continued, pouring the wheat into a clear container. "Humans found plants that could become food, but only if we helped them." The first step drew gasps from several species. Ben filled the container with water. Precious, life-giving water that most worlds rationed carefully. The idea of deliberately soaking seeds in drinking water struck many observers as borderline criminal. "This process is called soaking," Ben explained as the wheat began to absorb the liquid. "We're waking up the enzymes inside the grain. They've been sleeping, waiting for the right conditions to start growing." Professor Kiv's sensors were working overtime, analyzing every chemical change occurring in the container. "Fascinating. The water absorption is activating dormant biochemical processes within the seeds. But this still does not address the digestibility problem." Ben nodded. "That comes next. While this soaks, let me tell you about human evolution." He moved to another workstation and began arranging tools: a mortar and pestle, heating elements, and mixing bowls. Everything was standard laboratory equipment, but Ben was using it in ways that clearly puzzled his audience. "Humans evolved alongside wheat," he said. "When early humans discovered wild grasses with these seeds, we weren't smart enough to analyze their nutritional content with molecular scanners. We just knew we were hungry, and these plants grew everywhere." Dr. Yen watched nervously as Ben checked the soaking wheat. She knew what was coming next, and she also knew how it would look to species unfamiliar with human food preparation methods. "The thing is," Ben continued, draining the now softened wheat, "humans didn't evolve to eat wheat as it naturally occurs. We evolved to eat wheat as we learned to prepare it. We changed the wheat, and the wheat changed us." He placed the softened grain into the mortar and began grinding it with the pestle. The sound filled the laboratory, a rhythmic crushing that seemed almost violent to species accustomed to consuming food in its natural state. Several students in the observation deck began showing signs of distress. The energy-based life forms flickered erratically. The insectoid students clicked their mandibles in patterns that suggested deep concern. Even the normally stoic crystalline observers seemed to dim with what might have been anxiety. "You are destroying the organic structure," Professor Kiv observed. Sensors trained on the grinding process. "I'm releasing the nutrients," Ben corrected. "Watch what happens to the starches as the grain structure breaks down." Indeed, Professor Kiv's instruments were detecting remarkable changes. The complex starches that had been locked within the grain's tough exterior were now exposed and beginning to break down into simpler compounds. But the professor's bewilderment was only growing. "The chemical changes are significant, but your species lacks the specialized enzymes necessary to process these compounds efficiently." Ben paused in his grinding and smiled. "Actually, we do have them. They're just not where you'd expect." He lifted a small amount of the ground wheat on his finger and touched it to his tongue. The reaction from the observation deck was immediate and dramatic. Several species that used chemical communication flooded the air with alarm pheromones. The fourth-act student made sounds that didn't translate well but clearly indicated horror. "Human salivary glands produce amylase enzymes specifically adapted to break down grain starches," Ben explained, seemingly oblivious to the panic he was causing. "Our mouths are the first stage of wheat digestion, not our stomachs." Professor R. Kiv's instruments were detecting the enzyme activity in real time. The implications were staggering. Your species evolved specialized biochemistry for processing these specific plant materials. Not just biochemistry, Ben said, continuing to grind the wheat into increasingly fine flour. Look at human teeth. He opened his mouth, demonstrating the flat grinding surfaces of his molars. These evolved specifically for breaking down tough plant fibers. Human jaw muscles are positioned to generate the pressure needed to crush grain. Even our skull shape changed to accommodate the muscle attachments. Dr. Yen could see the moment when the full implications hit the assembled scientists. This wasn't just about eating an unusual food. This was about coevolution on a scale that most species had never encountered. Ben mixed the ground wheat with water, creating a paste that looked even less appealing than the original grain. To many observers, it resembled construction material more than anything edible. "This is dough," Ben announced. "It's wheat flour mixed with water. By itself, it's still not very nutritious. But watch what happens when we apply heat." He shaped the dough into flat cakes and placed them on a heated surface. The sizzling sound that followed drew more concerned reactions from the audience, but something else was happening too. As the first aromas of baking bread began to fill the laboratory, an unprecedented event occurred. Species that had never shared biological compatibility, whose biochemistry was so different they required separate atmospheres, began showing remarkably similar responses. Respiratory rates increased across multiple phyla. Species with appropriate glands began salivating. Even the methane-breathing Vorthak released chemical compounds that their translator interpreted as unexpected positive arousal. Professor Kiv's instruments were detecting something that bordered on impossible, a near-universal, positive response to the chemical compounds being released by heated wheat dough. "What is that scent?" whispered the tree-like student, its silver leaves rustling with what seemed to be anticipation. Ben flipped the flatbread, sending a fresh wave of aroma through the laboratory's atmosphere. "That's bread baking. It's a combination of proteins, breaking down, starches caramelizing, and yeast fermentation creating complex organic compounds." "Yeast?" Professor Kiv inquired. "Wild yeast from the air," Ben explained. "Microorganisms that live symbiotically with wheat plants. They're in the flour naturally. Heat activates them, and they help make the bread more digestible." The professor was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "You are describing a three-way symbiotic relationship. Humans, wheat plants, and microorganisms all evolved together in a mutually beneficial arrangement." Ben nodded, removing the finished bread from the heat. It was golden brown, aromatic, and recognizably food even to species that had never seen anything like it before. "This is what humans call bread," he said, tearing off a piece. "Would anyone like to try some?" The offer to share bread created a moment of profound silence in the laboratory. Ben held out pieces of the warm, golden flatbread while hundreds of alien scientists contemplated something unprecedented, voluntarily consuming what their most advanced analysis had classified as toxic waste. Dr. Yen stepped forward first, accepting a piece with visible relief. As the human liaison, she had eaten Earth foods countless times, but she understood the courage it would take for other species to try something so alien to their experience. "I can vouch for its safety," she said, taking a deliberate bite. The sound of her chewing seemed unnaturally loud in the silent laboratory. Humans have been eating bread for millennia without harmful effects. Professor Kiv's crystalline structure was cycling through colors so rapidly it looked like a light show. "This is highly irregular. We have no safety data for non-human consumption of processed teragrains." "Actually," said Dr. Yen, swallowing her bread, "we do." She moved to one of the laboratory computers and began pulling up files. The first human diplomatic missions carried Earth foods as cultural exchange items. We have consumption records for over 40 different species, including safety profiles and digestive compatibility analyses. The data that appeared on the screens around the laboratory caused another stir. Species after species listed as compatible with basic bread consumption. A few required minor modifications, less salt for the Calarians, different grain ratios for methane breathers, but the fundamental food was safe for nearly everyone present. "You knew," Professor Kiv stated. their color settling into what Ben was learning to recognize as accusation mixed with scientific intrigue. "We knew that other species could eat our food," Dr. Yen replied. "What we didn't know was that galactic science had classified our primary agricultural products as inedible waste." A brave Calarian student named Reef drifted down from the observation deck, their purple starfish form undulating with cautious curiosity. "May I attempt a small sample?" Ben offered a tiny piece of bread, watching as Reef absorbed it through specialized feeding surfaces. The reaction was almost immediate. Reef's coloration brightened, and they released a cloud of golden spores that Ben's translator interpreted as surprised delight. "This is remarkable," Reef announced to the assembled crowd. "The nutrient absorption is immediate and efficient. My digestive analysis indicates significantly higher bioavailability than predicted." This opened the floodgates. Suddenly, students and faculty were approaching from all directions, eager to experience this impossible food for themselves. Ben found himself tearing bread into smaller and smaller pieces, trying to accommodate everyone while the loaves lasted. Professor Kiv watched this unprecedented scene with growing fascination. Their instruments were recording not just the consumption, but the social dynamics. Species that normally avoided each other due to biological incompatibilities were gathering around, a common food source, sharing an experience that transcended their evolutionary differences. "Dr. Yen," the professor said, "I believe we need to discuss the implications of what we are observing." Dr. Yen nodded, moving to join Kiv at the main sensor array. "What are your instruments detecting?" "Biochemical compatibility across phylogenetic lines that should be impossible," Kiv replied, their color shifting to deep blue concentration. "But more than that. Watch the social interaction patterns." On the screens, behavioral analysis software was tracking movement and interaction among the various species. Normally, each group maintained careful distances based on chemical compatibility, communication methods, and environmental needs. Now those barriers were dissolving as everyone focused on the shared experience of trying human food. "Food as a social catalyst," Dr. Yen mused. "That's very human, actually." "Explain." Dr. Yen looked around the laboratory, where Ben was now, demonstrating how to properly chew bread to maximize enzyme interaction, while a fascinated audience of alien scientists took notes on optimal mastication techniques. "Humans don't just eat food," she began. "We share it. Meals are social events. Cooking for someone is an expression of care. Breaking bread together, that's literally what Ben just did, is how humans build relationships and communities." Professor Kiv processed this information while their sensors continued recording the ongoing food-sharing event. "You are suggesting that food preparation and consumption serve social functions beyond nutrition?" "Professor, human civilization is built around food. Our cities developed around fertile areas where we could grow crops. Our trade networks exist to move food from places where it grows well to places where people need it. Our calendars are organized around planting and harvest seasons. Our religions include rituals centered on bread and wine." The implications were staggering. Professor Kiv began pulling up comparative studies of other species' agricultural development. Most civilizations had developed around naturally occurring food sources, fruit groves, mineral deposits that filter-feeding species could process, energy fields that sustained plasma-based life forms. Humans had developed civilization around plants that required processing to become edible. "Your species created agriculture," Kiv realized. "Not just farming, but the fundamental transformation of biological material into nutrition." "We call it cooking," Ben said, overhearing the conversation while distributing the last of the bread samples. "But yes, humans learned to change food instead of just finding it." This simple statement contained multitudes. Ben continued, unaware that he was revolutionizing xenobiological theory with casual observations. "Every human world has adapted local plants and animals for food production. When we colonize a planet, we don't just look for places that already have what we need. We look for places that could have what we need if we work with the local ecosystem." Professor Kiv's entire worldview was reorganizing around this concept. "You perform biological modification without advanced genetic engineering technology. Selective breeding, crop rotation, composting, soil management. Ben listed. Humans have been doing genetic modification for thousands of years. We just called it farming. The tree-like student, now glowing with what appeared to be intellectual excitement, joined the conversation. This explains the Terra colony success rates. Human settlements thrive in environments that other species find marginal because you create suitable conditions rather than requiring them naturally. Dr. Yen smiled at this recognition. Every human colony ship carries seed banks and breeding stock. We don't just settle planets, we partner with them. The full scope of human uniqueness was becoming clear to the assembled scientists. Other species had developed advanced technology to adapt their environments to their needs. Humans had developed advanced biology to adapt their needs to their environments. The difference was more than academic. It represented a completely different approach to survival and civilization. Professor Kiv was already composing messages to colleagues across the galaxy. This discovery would revolutionize not just agricultural science, but evolutionary theory, colonization strategies, and interspecies relations. Human Ben, the professor said formally, would you be willing to collaborate on a comprehensive study of human agricultural practices? Ben looked around the laboratory, where dozens of alien scientists were comparing notes on bread consumption, while others were already discussing applications for their own struggling colonies. Sure, he said, simply. But you might want to see what we can do with rice too. 3 months after the bread demonstration, the Galactic Agricultural Institute had become the center of what scholars were calling the human food revolution. Ben found himself in the unexpected position of being the most sought-after graduate student in known space, with research requests flooding in from species across the galaxy. The transformation had begun almost immediately after Professor Kiv published the preliminary findings. The paper, titled Symbiotic Evolution and the Human Paradigm, had shattered conventional wisdom about agriculture, nutrition, and species development. But the real changes came when struggling colonies began requesting human agricultural consultants. Ben stood in what had once been Professor Kiv's private research lab, now expanded into a full department dedicated to applied human agricultural sciences. The holographic displays that had once mocked wheat as evolutionary failure now showed thriving crops on dozens of worlds that had been considered too marginal for settlement. Report from the Rigel 7 colony, announced Alex, one of Ben's new research partners. The young woman had transferred from Terra's agricultural college specifically to work on interspecies farming techniques. Their first wheat harvest exceeded all projections. The local soil, combined with human composting techniques, produced yields higher than some worlds with naturally fertile ground. Professor Kiv, whose academic reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by admitting error, reviewed the data with obvious satisfaction. Remarkable. The symbiotic relationship between human agricultural methods and indigenous soil microorganisms appears to be nearly universal. The success stories had been mounting steadily. A Calarian mining colony had transformed their waste processing areas into productive gardens using human crop rotation principles. A crystalline species had learned to cultivate earth grains in their mineral-rich environments, creating a food source that could sustain both their own people and visiting traders from other worlds. But perhaps the most significant change was happening right in the Institute's corridors. Species that had previously maintained strict segregation due to dietary incompatibilities were now gathering in the expanded cafeteria, sharing meals that incorporated human cooking techniques adapted for various biological requirements. The social implications may be as important as the agricultural ones, Dr. Yen observed, joining the group around the holographic displays. She had been promoted to head the new Department of Interspecies Nutrition, a position that hadn't existed before Ben's demonstration. Food diplomacy, Ben said, watching through the lab windows as a group of Vortax students shared fermented grain cakes with their insectoid classmates. My grandmother always said that the best way to understand someone was to eat their food. Alex pulled up another report, this one from the frontier regions where first contact protocols were still being developed. The Exploration Council is requesting human food specialists for all new contact missions. Apparently, offering to cook for recently discovered species has become our most effective diplomatic tool. This was unprecedented in galactic history. Most first contact situations involved complex negotiations about atmospheric compatibility, communication protocols, and territorial boundaries. Humans had revolutionized the process by simply asking, "What do you eat? And can we help you grow? More of it?" Professor Kiv manipulated the display to show a galaxy-wide map. Hundreds of worlds now glowed with indicators showing human agricultural assistance programs. The pattern is clear. Wherever human farming techniques are introduced, not only do crop yields improve, but interspecies cooperation increases. Why? Do you think that is? Ben asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Because hunger is universal, Dr. Yen replied. Every species understands the need for food. When you help someone eat better, you're addressing their most basic survival need. The truth was more complex than that, but also more simple. Humans had discovered something that more technologically advanced species had missed. Survival wasn't just about having enough resources, it was about creating abundance from scarcity. Alex brought up the latest data from Terra's agricultural stations. Earth's food production has increased by 30% since we started incorporating techniques learned from other worlds. Calarian soil enhancement methods work beautifully with human crops, and Vorthak fermentation processes have created entirely new categories of preserved foods. Ben smiled at this news. The agricultural exchange wasn't one way. While humans were teaching other species to transform their environments, those species were teaching humans new ways to work with plants and soil that Earth's farmers had never imagined. The request list keeps growing, Professor Kiv noted, scrolling through official communications from governments across the galaxy. Colony worlds, established agricultural planets, even some of the paradise worlds want human consultants to optimize their food production. This was the most surprising development of all. Species from worlds where food grew naturally and abundantly were discovering that human techniques could create variety, improved nutrition, and more efficient resource use. The galaxy's agricultural paradise worlds were learning from the species that came from a hostile dirt ball. Ben looked at his latest assignment, a request from the Centauri Agricultural Collective to help them develop sustainable farming practices for their expanding population. 6 months ago, he had been an unknown exchange student. Now governments were competing to hire him. There's something else, Alex said, bringing up a new display. The cultural exchange programs are reporting unprecedented applications. Species that never had any interest in human culture are suddenly requesting full immersion experiences. Dr. Yen laughed. They want to learn to cook. More than that, Professor Kiv corrected, analyzing the application data. They want to understand the philosophy behind human agricultural development. Several species have requested to study human history, specifically the development of farming communities and food-based societies. Ben understood what they were really asking for. They wanted to learn how to build civilizations around creating abundance rather than just consuming what nature provided. They wanted to learn how to partner with their worlds instead of just living on them. Professor Kiv, Ben said, what happened to your original research on evolutionary dead ends? The crystalline professor's structure brightened with what Ben now recognized as academic humor. I have retitled the study, Evolutionary Innovations Requiring Symbiotic Partners. The same plant materials I classified as failures are now being recognized as examples of coevolution requiring intelligent cultivation partners. Alex pulled up the latest agricultural reports from across the galaxy. World after world showing increased food security, improved nutrition, and expanding populations. The human approach to agriculture was solving food shortages that some species had accepted as natural limitations for millennia. The irony, Dr. Yen observed, is that we never thought of ourselves as special. We just did what we had to do to survive on a difficult planet. Ben nodded, looking out at the bustling institute campus, where dozens of species were learning to grow, prepare, and share food together. His grandmother's stories had been right. Humans did have something special. They had learned that survival wasn't about finding paradise. It was about creating it. I've been thinking about something, Ben said, turning back to the group. Every species we've worked with has had the same reaction when they taste bread, for the first time. Even species with completely different biology seem to recognize it as food. Professor Kiv's sensors focused on Ben with interest. You have a theory about this phenomenon? Maybe, Ben said slowly. What if the reason bread appeals to so many different species isn't because it's universally nutritious, but because it represents something universal? The transformation of raw materials into something better than the sum of their parts. Dr. Yen considered this idea. Food as a symbol of intelligence applied to survival. More than that, Alex added, pulling up comparative studies. Look at the consumption data. Species don't just eat human foods for nutrition, they seek them out. There's an emotional component that our instruments can't quite measure. This was true. The cafeteria report showed that while species could survive perfectly well on their traditional diets, many now actively preferred meals that incorporated human cooking techniques. The request wasn't just for food, it was for the experience of transformed food. Hope, said a new voice from the laboratory entrance. Everyone turned to see Director Nash, the Institute's head administrator, entering with a delegation of officials from the Galactic Council. The elderly human woman had been overseeing the agricultural revolution with a mixture of pride and careful diplomacy. Hope? Professor Kiv inquired. Director Nash approached the holographic displays, studying the galaxy-wide map of agricultural assistance programs. Every species faces scarcity eventually. Resources run out, populations grow, environments change. Most species respond by adapting to less, making do with what remains available. She gestured to the data surrounding them. Humans respond by making more. When we show other species that they can transform their environments instead of just adapting to them, we're showing them that scarcity isn't permanent. That's hope. The Galactic Council delegate, a floating energy being that communicated through controlled electromagnetic pulses, transmitted something that the translators rendered as profound agreement. This is why the Council has approved the expansion of human agricultural programs to all member worlds, the delegate announced. Not merely for the practical benefits, though those are significant, but for the philosophical impact on galactic civilization. Ben looked around the room at the faces and sensor arrays and energy patterns of beings from across the known galaxy, all focused on the simple concept of making food from grain. His demonstration had been about wheat, but it had revealed something much larger about humanity's place in the universe. There's one more thing, he said, pulling up a personal message on his communications device. I got this yesterday from my first consulting assignment. The message appeared in the holographic display, transmitted from the struggling mining colony on Kepler 186F. The text was simple, but the attached image showed vast fields of golden grain waving under an alien sun, with beings from 3 different species working together in the harvest. The message read, "Thank you for teaching us to see food where we saw only weeds. Our children will grow up in a world of abundance because you showed us how to plant hope." Professor Kiv's crystalline structure went through a slow, deliberate color change that Ben had learned to recognize as deep contemplation. Human Ben, your species has given the galaxy something unprecedented. What's that? The knowledge that intelligence plus determination can overcome natural limitations. That cooperation between species and their environments can create abundance where none existed before. That survival is not about accepting what is, but about creating what could be. Ben looked out the laboratory windows again, watching as students from dozens of worlds practiced the ancient human art of kneading dough. They were learning more than cooking techniques. They were learning that with patience, effort, and the right knowledge, even the most unpromising raw materials could become sustenance. Director Nash moved to join Ben at the window. Your grandmother would be proud. She always said humans were stubborn, Ben replied. Too stubborn to accept that. Anything was impossible, including making food from evolutionary failures? Ben smiled, remembering that first day in Professor Kiv's lecture hall, when the most advanced agricultural science in the galaxy had dismissed humanity's most basic food source as worthless waste. Especially that. As if summoned by their conversation, a message alert chimed throughout the laboratory. Alex checked the incoming communication and her eyes widened. "It's from the Deep Space Exploration Division," she announced. "They've made contact with a new species. Preliminary reports indicate they're facing severe food shortages on their homeworld." Professor Kiv's color brightened with anticipation. "I assume they are requesting human agricultural assistance?" "More than that," Alex said, reading the full message. "They're asking if we can teach them to cook." Ben laughed, a sound that seemed to harmonize with Professor Kiv's harmonic vibrations and the energy delegate's electromagnetic pulses. Somewhere across the galaxy, another species was about to discover that the difference between survival and abundance might be as simple as knowing how to grind grain into flour. The revolution that had started with a raised hand in a lecture hall was still spreading, one meal at a time, one world at a time, one species at a time. And at its heart was the most human of all concepts, the unshakable belief that things could always be better than they were. In his pocket, Ben carried a small sample of wheat, the same evolutionary failure that had started everything. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths were hidden in the most ordinary things, waiting for someone stubborn enough to see potential where others saw only problems. The galaxy was full of species that had learned to survive. Humans were teaching them how to thrive.